In the meantime here, we do want to get into more of these top headlines. As you know, today was day one, kicking off the NATO Summit in Washington, and all eyes were on President Biden's performance there. He spoke to the crowd. Fox's Connor Hansen has a look. Let's watch.
It's another high-stakes test for President Joe Biden, under constant scrutiny since his concerning debate performance against former President Trump. This time, he's hosting the leaders of other NATO countries at a summit in Washington. The Biden administration is hoping to reassure allies the president is healthy and isn't going anywhere.
I'm not aware of anyone raising concerns with the secretary or anyone else from the State Department about the president.
The 75th anniversary of NATO here, all of our guests from around the world. What we're projecting from the White House is not strength right now, at a very dangerous time around the world.
Ukraine will likely be a top issue at the summit. Democrats argue former President Trump won't be as supportive as he has been critical of NATO in the past.
We in the Senate will send President Zelensky and our NATO allies the same message we have shared from day one. America will never turn its back on you. The same cannot be said for Donald Trump.
Heading into the summit, Biden officials still facing a barrage of questions.
If the national security team needs to get to the president, they get to the president. And it doesn't matter what the hour on the clock says. He's always there. He's always available. And they have ready access to him.
At the end of the NATO summit later this week, President Biden will hold a rare and highly anticipated press conference, taking questions directly from reporters. In New York, Connor Hansen, Fox News.
Connor, thanks so much. In the meantime here, we want to talk about the significance of this year's NATO Summit taking place there in Washington. We're going to do that with our friend at the Heritage Foundation, Robert Greenway. He joins me. Robert, thanks for being with us here. I know you probably watched President Biden's speech about the significance, the importance, the history of the alliance. It's been around now for 75 years. That very event took place in the Mellon Auditorium, where then President Harry Truman signed the charter there. What do you make that this is taking place in Washington on the 75th anniversary? In the last year, since the last summit, 2 new members have joined the alliance there in Sweden and Finland, but all eyes on the war in Ukraine today, right?
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Andrew. I think it's a consequential moment, one of the most significant tests of the alliance in its 75-year history. And we are now in the second year of a major land war, the most significant since the end of the Second World War, something the alliance was designed to prevent. And I think we all know in the back of our minds that behind it was a lack of deterrence. And ultimately, Putin invaded Ukraine twice, when President Biden was vice president in 2014, and again when he was in the White House as president. And so as the now 32 members face and confront this new challenge, questions about President Biden's competency in order to lead the alliance forward, and a recognition that more has to be done. Yeah. The population of NATO has grown significantly. Its GDP has grown, but its commitment to defense spending has dithered and is in fact half of what it used to be. That's got to change if they're going to confront the challenge of bring this land conflict to a successful conclusion.
But Robert, we have seen in the wake of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, more NATO members, at least publicly, commit to upping their GDP targets to the alliance, right? I mean, that is a net effect of the invasion, and we've seen it, right?
But that's true. And look, I think faced with the proximity of the conflict, this is in their backyard, they're responding. But the reality is that their collective GDP has increased by 40 trillion. Their defense spending has been cut in half. They had 493 million new members in NATO since 1955, but they have 6 million less members serving in their armed services. You've got countries like France and Canada, for example, that are nowhere near the 2% mark. So many, like Poland and the Baltic states and Scandinavia, and now even Germany, are making their commitments clear to get to 2%, when in fact it probably ought to be 3%, but many are still not. And some of the largest economies in NATO are not making their milestones.
Yeah, let's talk about Ukraine, though, specifically. The readout from some of these conversations described those conversations as talking about a quote-unquote bridge to membership for Ukraine here. Are those commitments futile at this point, or is it an inevitability that Ukraine will eventually become a member of the alliance sometime down the road, 5, 10, 15 years on? Are they getting ahead of themselves by talking about this since it's not in the immediate future?
Look, I think what they ought to be talking about is how to end the conflict that Ukraine is in. And unless that happens, it's absolutely certain that they're not going to become a NATO member while they're in an active conflict or a war of attrition. And so I think the conversation ought to shift towards a strategy for conflict termination on terms favorable to the United States and to NATO and also to Kiev. But look, that's not happening. And as we know, the most recent supplemental passed by Congress, signed by President Biden, included a commitment to produce a strategy to get to that end state. And it's supposedly due by the end of this month. We'll see if it actually materializes. That's what the conversation ought to focus on. How do we end the conflict we're in, not get NATO membership for Ukraine?
So there has already been, I think, quite an announcement by the member states there today after President Biden's remarks on committing more air defense systems for Ukraine. I have the statement in front of me. This is a joint statement with Biden, also the Dutch Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, the Italian Prime Minister, the Romanian President, and Zelensky himself. Quote, today we're announcing that collectively we're providing Ukraine with additional strategic air defense systems, including additional Patriot batteries donated by the U.S., Germany, and Romania. Also, Patriot components donated by the Netherlands and other partners to enable the operation of an additional Patriot battery. Robert, we know some Patriot systems are there on the ground. They're working. They're doing what they're intended to do. Is this too little too late, or should they get as many Patriot systems there for air defense as they can when they can?
Well, I think two things. After the most recent Russian strike, it's clear that there is a need for integrated air defense. It's clear that our European partners need to fulfill the majority of that requirement because the United States has commitments not just in Europe, but we also have commitments with our partners and allies in Israel, whose conflict is about to expand to southern Lebanon and may require additional air defense support as well. And we have, of course, the potential for escalation in the Indo-Pacific. And if we commit high priority and high demand items like integrated air defense, like Patriot, into the European conflict, we may find ourselves unable to defend our interests elsewhere. This is, again, where European allies need to step up. But more importantly, how does this contribution of resources, the most recent supplemental, get us to a closer end to this conflict? Not a perpetual state of war, but a true successful conclusion.
You know, I'm curious, do you think, because there's every NATO nation's leader there in D.C. now, do you think Hungarian leader Viktor Orban is going to get an earful from his NATO colleagues after his recent meeting last week with Vladimir Putin? He's also met recently with Xi Jinping. We also know the Indian leader, Narendra Modi, the prime minister, is meeting with Putin in Russia as well. So these meetings are taking place. These conversations are taking place. Do you think there's going to be a lot of side conversations with Orban about what he was thinking, or no?
I suspect there will be side conversations. I'm not sure they'll be with Prime Minister Orban, but I do believe that everyone across the board is looking for a way out of this. I think everyone desperately wants to see a successful conclusion, a satisfactory conclusion to this conflict. And I think everyone is looking for the United States to provide that leadership, and it's not resident. This is an opportunity for that to happen. Hopefully it'll materialize, but there are no indications as yet there is a Biden plan to get to the end of this conflict.
And Robert, we know that there's going to be a new NATO Secretary General very, very soon here. This is somewhat of a farewell tour for Jens Stoltenberg. President Biden bestowed on him today the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which I thought was, you know, quite poignant there, talking about the special relationship between them and the U.S. and NATO in particular there. What about the incoming new Secretary General, Mark Rutte? What about this term, Trumpproofing NATO? Do you think that's on the top of mind of many NATO leaders there in D.C.? What is possibly a second Trump term going to look like for the alliance?
Well, it's a question that comes up quite often. Look, first on Jens Stoltenberg, and we just hosted him at Heritage just a few months ago. He's widely respected as being one of the most effective leaders at a very difficult time. And so he gets a tremendous amount of credit, and I think it's well-deserved. and the recognition is good to see. In terms of a successor, look, I wish we choose a successor from one of the countries in NATO that's making a significant contribution north of the 2% Wales Agreement. Unfortunately, that's not the case, at least not for the moment. In terms of concerns about President Trump, look, what NATO does know, having spent 4 years under his presidency, is that Putin did not commit to the greatest land war in Europe we've seen since the end of the Second World War. And so I think he presents a real hope, but they also recognize there's no free lunch. They're going to have to pull their own weight and meet commitments, and he's going to hold them to account. And Stoltenberg was instrumental in assisting and supporting that, and he would admit to it.
Robert, just lastly, though, in the event, in whatever happens in the next 4 years, Putin grabs more land, the Baltics, Poland. This is hypothetical, obviously. Are you confident that if President Trump is back in the White House, he will come to NATO's side?
I don't have any doubts that President Trump would support the alliance and fulfill the United States commitment to it. I don't think Putin's in a position now to threaten, but I think he's rebuilding his capacity. I hope that President Trump will again prevent Russian aggression, and I think he has the best chance of doing it.
All right, Robert Greenway, we're going to leave it at that. Thanks so much for your time. Talk soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.